A good while back, I remember working on the packaging design for one of the first alcopop brands. They were pretty exciting products to work on, and it was the first time there'd been a real competitor or alternative to beers, wines and spirits. That excitement wasn't to last long. There was a huge uproar at the time over the advent of these particular products and their potential appeal to underage drinkers, as many of the pack designs focused on characterisation and exuberant graphics. Many of the packs featured cartoons and characterisations of the fruit from which the products were born from. The overall tone was of playfulness and exuberance, much more of a student night out than refined drinking. Understandably, this led to quite a large backlash from various consumer channels, and many of the brands were pulled from the supermarket shelves. The brands that were left grew up and became a little more serious, more adult, and a little more refined. The alcohol sector had learnt a valuable lesson, or so we thought. So it's quite odd to see that some of the beer brands are now picking up on some of these cues that led to the downfall of alcopops. In this podcast, I'll be looking at a few of these brands and how they could potentially be falling into the same trap as their alcopop predecessors. The first brand I wanted to look at is Northern Monk, and specifically their Rocket variety. At the risk of not wanting to look like anything else out there, the brand has adopted a somewhat childish approach to its visual identity. The can itself features a huge ice lolly in the shape of a rocket, with typography possibly much more reminiscent of Saturday morning kids' TV. It clearly borrows from classic ice lollies of the 1980s at the expense of any beer credentials. It would look much more at home on the back of an ice cream van or in one of those corner shop confectioners. So why do this? It's possibly to create a visual aesthetic that appeals to the nostalgic drinker. However, these visual references have no recall for younger drinkers today. This lack of a reference point means that the visual aesthetic is decoded at face value, rather than pinpointing a particular period or recalling a specific nostalgia. The net result is a very naive brand feel that borrows from the exuberance of carbonates and confectionery. This ultimately raises the question of responsible marketing. Could this reference point be met in a cleverer, more grown-up way in order that appeal to underage drinkers is negated? The other important aspect to look at is the characterisation and introduction of cartoons onto packaging. Back in the 90s, Viz created an adult market for cartoons and comic strips. Similarly, there have been a few cartoon series on TV that have popped up with a much more adult sense of humour. Some brands such as Beavertown have taken this cartoon approach and used it to create a visual identity for their alcohol brands. The packs themselves feature quite surreal cartoons based on programmes like Adventure Time and have overlaid typography quite naively placed over the back of busy backgrounds, making them quite difficult to read. Now clearly this creates a visual aesthetic that is very different to the traditional beer format, but by doing so sacrifices all the beer cues by borrowing heavily from soft drinks. The need to stand out has fueled a challenger approach in the beer sector, and by doing so has created a visual aesthetic that could be criticised, as with the alcopops of the 90s, of creating appeal to underage drinkers. The other important factor to mention with this approach is that this naivety of execution tends to sacrifice standout and communication on shelf. You have to get fairly close up to read any of the information on the label at all. In fact, you could say that this has been approached entirely as a comic strip rather than as a credible piece of packaging. Sure, the point of difference draws you in, but this tends to only work at around 30 centimetres when you're holding it in your hand, rather than about 1.5 metres, 2 metres away when you're viewing it on a shelf. As I've discussed previously, successful packaging needs to work at both of these viewpoints. So I wonder, is this visual naivety intentional, or is it just poor brand design? This juxtaposition of style and content worked well for Viz as a comic strip, where they married adult themes with irreverent cartoon characters. That's what made it risque. However, it has the potential to make adult consumables appeal to underage drinkers, and in doing so may suffer the same fate as the alcopops did back in the 90s. So, we've looked at nostalgia and the introduction of cartoons and characterisation to beer brands. Next up, a section I'd like to call craft or daft. As I mentioned, this specific introduction of playfulness has created the risk for some of these brands in causing the same issues as alcopops did. The other important byproduct that this visual approach creates in its desire to be different is an overall naivety of design. It's almost an anti-design approach to branding. Which brings me on to Tiny Rebel, my next example. Tiny Rebel take a very similar cartoon approach to Beavertown, but they seem to be much more influenced by cartoons such as The Simpsons or Family Guy. The packs are incredibly playful and incredibly exuberant. Sure, consumers want to see something exciting, something different, but it also has to be visually appealing and representative of the product they're purchasing. Craft beer needs to show an element of consideration and expertise. That's paramount in creating trust with the consumer and showcasing brewery credentials and specialisms. Tiny Rebel, in the desire to shake up the category, have tried to borrow from urban street art to add some edginess and Shoreditch cool. However, rather than reference Banksy, they've pinpointed more Bart Simpson with a set of felt tip pens. This naive and somewhat childish approach misses the mark completely on quality credentials and creates a much more pastiche, cheap look and feel, much more daft than craft. Well, that's it. That's a wrap, as they say. I hope you found it informative. If it adds value, then please do subscribe. I'm Al, owner and creative director of Slice Design. You can follow me on my LinkedIn page, which is linkedin.com/in/Alan Gilberty, or you can follow us on our company website, which is slicedesign.co.uk. So until next time, have a fantastic week and keep well.